Hi everybody, Sally here, and today I am going to go through how to knit a lining behind a single motif to keep all those floats tucked away nicely. The long floats on the single motifs are one of the hardest things to deal with in a neat and tidy fashion. There are various ways you can do it. You can latch them up afterwards, you can pick up the floats as you go, or you can run a line of sewing thread through the motif afterwards, which will sink into the channels between the stitches and won't show. The latch up method is the one that I would normally use. I don't have a lot of success with the picking up the floats as you go, because unless you've got the kind of pattern where you can pick the float up onto a stitch of the same colour, you're always going to get an element of show through on the front of the work. And on things like this that have got two really strong casting colours, I find it's not always desperately successful. So, and then I remembered reading a long time ago in one of the old To and Fro magazines about knitting a mesh, and I thought, oh, I'll give that a little try. I was planning on knitting these little cardigans for my great nieces, one of whom is not only suffering lockdown, but as poor little mite has got chicken pox. So I thought I'd make them a little something to cheer them up. And so I'd been experimenting with the single motif, which I showed you how to do on a video the other day. And then I thought afterwards, well, I'll show you how to tidy it up by knitting the mesh lining, and that's what it came out with on the back. This was just a little sample piece that I did. This is in a 4-ply acrylic, and the yarn that I used for the mesh was 1-ply super sheen, which this is a Yeoman Yarns product, and I know they're going to discontinue it, so I think they might be selling it at a slightly discounted price at the moment, but when it's gone, it's gone. So if you wanted to get some, now is your chance. Just to give you an idea of how thin this is, the minty green one is a regular 4-ply. That's the one on the right. And the super sheen is a 1-ply. So there's the difference between the two yarns. The super sheen is quite thin. But actually on the one that I'm going to demonstrate for you today, I've been using another Yeoman yarn, which is it's called Volga 50/50, 50% acrylic and 50% wool. And I've only recently come across this yarn, not one I'd tried until I knitted myself a green and cream cardigan a little while ago. And I was because I've always wanted, I always like the idea of having the mixture of the wool and the acrylic. I find some wools are a little bit tough on my skin. I get sort of like an allergic reaction to it, so I was going to try the 50/50, and it knitted up really nicely. And on my standard gauge machine, my stitch dial set at 7, it came out an absolutely perfect 4-ply tension using 2 strands together of 28 stitches and 40 rows to the 10 centimetres, so that's 7 stitches and 10 rows to the inch. Yeah, they describe it as a 3-ply, and 2 strands together make a perfect 4-ply. Now, I'm not much of a one for using industrial yarns, so I'm not very often involved in knitting 2 or 3 yarns together, but it knitted up perfectly. This very, very nice. I'm quite pleased with that. I'll be buying that again. That's I've knitted my cardi front using 2 strands of the cream, and there's the little motif on the pocket there. I'm showing this on a pocket, which is another topic that I've been investigating for you. That will be another video later on how to do various different pockets. This is just a basic, like you do it on a hand knitting one, where you knit the pocket lining first and then make a slight slit in the knitting on the front here, and then put the pocket in after, behind the little motif, because this is obviously 24 stitches wide as it's a punch card, and the pattern, the whale pattern, is 28 rows, so it makes quite a nice little almost square pocket on a little kiddie's cardie. But before I go to stitch the pocket down in place, behind the motif, I want to put the lining on so that when the little kiddie fingers get poked inside the pocket, they don't get stuck in all these floats, because obviously this is a motif that's got some really big floats on the back, as you can see, and like your kids would just get tangled up in that in no time at all. Oh, I've just noticed I've got a thread caught up there. That'll need snipping and dealing with. So I also found that this motif was an absolute, excuse my French, bugger to knit. It was not cooperative at all. Fortunately, that didn't knit through as a stitch, so I just cut that thread off there, and we'll tie that off. Single motifs are very forgiving about cock-ups and mistakes. Because of these long floats, you can often tidy up the mess afterwards and cut the float and tie it up, which is just what I'm doing here off camera, so you can't see what a numpty I've been. So no, what I've done there is the float got caught on the side, and I've just cut it and tied it off, so that's going to get sorted out inside my pocket lining. Now, the original pattern for this whale only had one row of plain knitting in between the waves and the whale, which didn't give me a lot of wiggle room to pick up the stitches across the back for the lining. So I've actually altered it and put 2 rows in between the waves and the whale. It came out of Wendy Phillips' Animal Motifs book. But if you've got that book, just keep a careful eye on some of those punch cards, because they are designed to be knitted as a single motif. So if I wanted to put a row of whales across there, their faces would be up against the tail of the one in front, because it's designed to be knitted just once rather than in a line of them across. If that makes sense to you all. Right, so what I'm going to do is find my pickup tool. I'm going to use a 2x1 transfer tool. So I've lost my camera. Well, there you go, 2x1. And I'm going to pick up this row across the bottom here, which has got the 2 blue stitches from the top of the waves. And that is 2 rows below the start of the motif. I mean, if you have trouble seeing where to pick this up afterwards, when you're at that point, or even you could even do it afterwards, you can get a bodkin and some contrasting sewing cotton and just make some marker threads through that row of knitting, and so you can see which loops of threads to pick up, but I can see that okay. It's 2, and I want to come out 2 stitches beyond the edge of the motif, and so I'm going to stick this on needles 26 and 28 there. Can you see what I'm doing? Now let's move that back a bit. So I've picked up my 2 stitches, and I'm going to hook it onto the needles. And I'm just going to go all the way across that row, doing the same thing. You can also, run your ravel cord through on a bodkin if you want to mark the row, and then that will pull out nicely. I know at the minute we're all having a lot of trouble getting supplies of various knitting things. I have found that if you can't get hold of ravel cord, there are a couple of things that work quite well as a substitute, one of which is 1mm thick rat tail, which is something used for kumihimo braiding, amongst other things, or else dental floss, or a very shiny embroidery cotton, like perlé cotton thread will do it. But you basically want something that's very smooth, that when you go to pull it out afterwards isn't going to leave lots of lovely coloured fibres across your pale knitting. There we go. Nice 2. So that's the last 2 across there. So I've now got 24 stitches for the motif plus 2 either side, and for my my mesh lining here, I'm just going to use one strand of this Volga 50/50. I'm going to keep the same tension, same stitch size as I had for my main knitting, even though I'm using a much thinner thread, and I'm going to knit the same number of rows. So I started 2 rows below my motif began, and the motif was 28 rows, so I'm going to knit 30 rows. I don't know if you can see on this one, but that's the top of the wale, and I'll be able to pick up right across the top of the last row. I'll do that afterwards when I stitch it down by hand. Let's just put that in there. Set my row counter to 0. Just wrap that yarn around the needle there to secure it. Might want to put a couple of weights on, although the weight of the knitting is probably enough to hold it there. It's 12. So that's my 30 rows. Break off my thread. And, transfer tool. There we go. And I'm just going to cast this off now. I did experiment on the teddy bear version of taking these stitches off on a garter bar or a decker comb, as a decker comb, where you could lift these the whole lot off, and then I put to stop them all coming off the thing. I clamped this with a bulldog clip like this. Stops all the stitches sliding off the decker comb. And then I picked up the stitches from the top of the motif and then rehung these on and cast it off. But to be quite honest, it was quite a fiddle with the decker comb. And there's always that nagging fear that the stitches are going to fall off it and you'll lose the whole blasted thing. So in the end, I found that as it's only a little bit of stitching, and you've got to stitch the sides down anyhow, it was just as easy to sew the top down in place as well. Here is, I just do around the gate post or sinker post cast off to make sure I've got a nice row of even open loops. I think of all the things that I do on the knitting machine, casting off is the thing I hate the most. Not least because it's fraught with possibilities of error, as you can see. As you get carried away and drop stitches. I have got a linker, but I can never get the linker thing to work. It keeps missing the pickup stitch, and when you're knitting something, or you get to the end of a piece of knitting that you've invested quite some time in, the last thing you want to do is to cast it off with a piece of equipment that you can't trust. So I'm afraid I do it the slow, painful way, with the transfer tool. But like anything else, once you've got the muscle memory in, you can get a little bit quicker at it. Although I do try not to get too cocky, because I keep doing things like this, dropping the stitch. we have it. Take the weights off, lift off the gate peg. So now what I can do with this is probably go and press it before I start stitching it down, but I will just pin that up into place. Poke the pocket through to the front. Pin that down into place using a handy knitting pin thingy, and I'm just going to pin this in place for you so you can see how it covers up the lining. I can't sew this down at the minute because I haven't sewn all my ends in first. So but there you go. Once it's all pinned in place, you can just slip stitch round the edge of that, catching the edge of the knitting and the heel of the stitches as you go up one side. Try to keep it up the side of where you've done your wrapping on your single motif, and then when your pocket lining is done, you can actually do this for a single motif. You could do it across the whole of the width of the knitting if you wanted to, in which case though I would recommend using the finest yarn you can, like the 1-ply, or if you've got any industrial yarns, a 230s or something like that would work just as well. Obviously if you've got one that exactly matches your background colour, brilliant. If not, then you know, a fairly neutral colour like a beige or a pale grey will usually do the trick, or something like that. So there we go. That's how to knit a lining for to hide your floats.